So the next type of polar reaction we want to revise is the so-called substitution reaction. And in a substitution reaction, we can say very general, functional group will be replaced by another functional group. And here we divide the substitution reactions into two different types. The first is the nucleophilic substitution, and the second, the nucleophilic acyl substitution. So if we start with the nucleophilic substitution reaction, then we have a nucleophile which attacks the electrophile, and here in this case the electrophile is a normal alkane with a halogen as substituent. So then, based on the difference in electronegativity between carbon and halogen, we know that the carbon is partially positive charged, and here the nucleophile will attack. Hereby, we then form a new carbon nucleophile bond, while the halogenide ion will leave the molecule, and all these steps will happen during a so-called concerted substitution reaction. So we just have one step, and the new carbon nucleophile bond will be formed at the same time when we break the old carbon halogenide bond. And the second type of substitution reaction is shown here. It is the nucleophilic axial substitution. Here we now have the nucleophile which attacks the carbon-oxygen bond of the electrophile, and important to know is that we now don't have an alkane with a halogenide as substituent, but now we have a so-called acyl chloride, for example. We can also have other halogen atoms here. And then we have now a two-step reaction mechanism. In the first step, the substitution will take place. So we create a new carbon nucleophile bond, and the negative charge will be centered at the oxygen. So this intermediate is then an alkoxide ion. And in the second step, then we will, let's say, leave the halogenide ion out of the molecule so that the carbon-oxygen double bond is reformed. And this is the second type of substitution reaction. And then, in principle, we can have a third type, which is called electrophilic substitution reaction. But here I do not want to talk too much about, because this kind of reaction will be more discussed with our lecture about benzene, because benzene is very characteristic for such a kind of reaction. Besides the polar reactions, we also have radical reactions, and a radical reaction always involves a series of steps in which each step generates a radical product. And this series of steps always starts with the initiation step, and here we can either heat or we can shine UV radiation on the system. And this initiation step is then the first formation of a radical. And for such a starting step, we usually need a so-called initiator, which can be, for example, peroxides, because peroxides have quite weak bonds, so we can easily split the bond when we heat up or we shine UV radiation on it. And then, after this starting step, we then start the series of subsequent steps. And here we can see we start with the first formed radical, maybe from peroxide. And then this first step is called the radical abstraction step, because this radical will then abstract the hydrogen atom from the non-radical reactant. After this step, we end up with a newly formed radical and protonated former radical, which is now no longer a radical. Then, in the second step, the so-called radical addition step, the newly formed radical will now react with the alkene and in an addition reaction. So we will end up with a radical. And then in the third step, the so-called radical abstraction step, we will, again, similar to the first step, extract a hydrogen atom from a non-radical reactant, and then we will end up with an alkane and the regenerated first radical. Overall, the total reaction mechanism is then the sum of all these single steps, and to summarize, we can say that we add an alkene to an alkane. And in general, always when we have radicals in the system, we know that the radicals have a very high reactivity in organic chemistry.